we can get to that later. I am joined with Arnaud Develay. Welcome to the show, man. How you doing this morning? You doing all right?
Hello, Jamal. Thank you for having me. I'm doing fine. Thank you.
No, man. Thank you for joining me, Arnaud Develay. And I want to make sure I'm getting your last name correctly. Is Develay correct? Excellent.
Perfect.
Arnaud Develay, he's an international lawyer specializing in international criminal law and participated in the defense of President Saddam Hussein, along with former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark. In the wake of the Caesar Act, he documented the illegal sanction regime imposed on Syria while living in Damascus. He is the author of Foreign Entanglements, Biden, Ukraine, and the Fracturing of American Political Consensus. Arnaud, you are the person to talk to today, man. I'm glad you could join me. Thank you for this, especially such early time in the morning. Um, I want to start first with Russia, and I want to pivot a little bit to the interplay between Russia and Syria. So let's start with Russia first. So one of the reportings that is, oh, wait a minute, let me fix this before we get started. There we are. One of the reportings, or one of some of the reporting that has come out, has pointed to desertions in Ukrainian armed forces, saying that these were heavy. I mean, apparently there are like 95,000 cases going back to 2022, but these have skyrocketed over the last several months in regards to the war. Can you talk about this for a bit and give us a heads up on where things stand in conflict?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yes, yes. Okay. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the Ukraine theater in conjunction with the Syrian situation. We see what happens when, on one hand, you have regular militaries, i.e., the one that used to exist in Syria, which was hollowed out by, let's say, at least 15 years, 14, 15 years of sanctions, non-access to their resources, their own resources, being decoupled from the dollar system, and therefore being unable to sustain morale over time, being essentially hollowed out with the whole Western alliance basically pitching in trying to eradicate, obliterate the capacity of that country to mount a fight over the long term. And when you look at the situation in Ukraine, where by all accounts the conflict is heavily tilting in favor of Russia, nonetheless, because and owing to the heavy support of said Western alliance, with billions upon billions of dollars. I mean, we are estimating now that since the start of the special military operation, Ukraine has received no less than $120 billion. The US providing for half of this amount, that we have conscription laws being passed repeatedly with for the current wave of forced conscription, the plan being to throw into the meat grinder no less than 200,000 conscript. This on the back of a law calling for the age of conscription to be lowered to 18 years old. And despite this military disaster and the very high rate of attrition on the Ukrainian side, we're still dealing with the situation as of right now, as I speak to you, with the two armies essentially exchanging positions around key settlements alongside the front line. Within a couple of days, you have the Russian armed forces taking control of a reservoir or some heights around, a key location on the front, and within a couple of days, the Ukrainians will take it back. So we're really dealing with a situation where, with the Trump administration coming in January 20th, on the background of Trump and Zelensky meeting in Paris a few days ago, with the result that basically Zelensky is turning down Trump's injunction calling for a ceasefire. Uh, Everything is looking as if Zelensky is trying to make it as difficult as possible for Trump to be negotiating in a situation where a positive outcome can come out. And we know that a few weeks back, authorizations were given to Kiev to use those long-range missiles deep into Russian territory. This is also part of the course as we speak now, with constant attacks on what Russia calls its old territories. We'll call it Russia proper, whether it's in Bryansk or Belgorod, with also attacks on Crimea, Sebastopol going back to last June, and also the wide use of drones, dozens of drones being sent basically on civilian areas, no military use whatsoever, but to inflict terror essentially. With the epics of this use of drone happening a few days back when the Chechen Republic was actually targeted, by a couple of drones, which is, somewhat removed from the front lines. So the Ukrainian side is really throwing everything they've got, the whole kitchen sink, trying at all cost to limit Russia's gains and Russia's position in future negotiation. And this is owing to the full-blown support. We know that the 24 billions that were floated, $24 billion floated by the departing Biden administrations, essentially did not succeed. But we still get substantial chunks of money still being somehow allocated to the Ukrainian theater. We know now, and the EU itself has stepped in and has dug into the Russian 300 billion slush fund, allocating 20 billion to the war effort. And we have declaration statements made by the NATO General Secretary Mark Rutte, who calls on a increase in NATO budget allocation from European countries from 2 to at least 3%, with the idea that they have to completely re-engineer their war budgets. So this is a situation where, as of this moment now, there's no talks of negotiations, no talks of ceasefire. The battles are raging all throughout the fronts, keeping in mind that there's a key point which has been discussed in other podcasts, I assume, which is the city of Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk is a hub. If the Russian armed forces were to succeed in taking Pokrovsk, essentially there would not be any defensive lines behind this. It would be all the way to Dnipropetrovsk, basically. So this explains in a large part why the Ukrainian armed forces are basically fighting not like their life depends on it. It does, but with everything on the line essentially, because they are being propped up by those who do not want any kind of negotiation to take place, or to the extent there are negotiations, they want to make sure that Russia is somehow limited in its negotiating levers. So this is where we are right now.
If Russia believes that Donald Trump is going to make, and let me ask this in a slightly different way. I got to be honest, I don't know what Trump will do when he gets in office. But it seems that the Biden administration believes that Donald Trump is going to do something different, at the very least try to bring this to a close. Otherwise, I don't know why Joe Biden is throwing everything at the wall in the way that he's doing, that he's risking these red lines. Donald Trump has come out and effectively attacked Joe Biden for doing so, slamming him, saying, basically, you're hijacking my foreign policy. You lost the race. You don't get to escalate in this way just before I get into office in order to screw up my ability to make a deal. From your point of view, I guess I don't see the point of what Zelensky is doing with this. And the reason I say this, up to this point, they've been completely incapable of stopping the Russian advance. And Petrovsk will fall, just like every other city that the Russians have put their attention to fell. And it seems that the Russian advance is getting faster, not slower. And it seems that Ukraine is getting weaker, not necessarily stronger. From your point of view, in regards to the negotiations, I mean, where do you think these are going to fall? I mean, let me ask you about Trump. Let me ask it that way. Do you believe that Donald Trump will come up with some level of negotiations? Like I said, at the very least, it seems that Joe Biden believes it. But do you trust Trump? And maybe trust is the wrong word for it. But do you believe this notion that he's going to try to bring it to a close? What are your thoughts on this before I go into other questions on this way?
Well, if we go by what Trump has been releasing as far as his statements, as far as his intent to put an end to the violence,
Mm-hmm.
we can only go with this idea that there's a call for a ceasefire, but a ceasefire at what cost?
Right.
I mean, we've seen the last few days in Syria that any kind of approach bearing on freezing conflicts is basically a recipe to have said conflict explode a few years back with the consequences that you could strategically find yourself on your back heel.
Mm-hmm.
So Russia is pretty much aware of this, if anything, having learned from the situation in Syria. So this idea that sure, the territories will be internationally recognized, but if the idea is to freeze the conflict, throwing in European nation peacekeepers, essentially, alongside a somewhat of a DMZ situation as we have in Korean Peninsula, uh, with some vague promises that Ukraine or what's left of it would not join NATO for any given amount of time, we might just basically be in a situation where 5 years down the road, 3 years down the road, who knows? I mean, Trump has only 2 years objectively where he can somehow make a difference. We don't know what might happen during the midterm elections in 2026. And obviously by 2028, he'll be gone. So who knows who might replace him and with what intent. So the Russians are really now angling to make sure that uh, what they put forward during the Istanbul peace negotiation in 2022 is the roadmap. And this calls for essentially a reinvention of the European architecture,
Mm-hmm.
with basically Ukraine becoming a demilitarized, denazified, of course, and forever a neutral, somewhat of a gray zone in the continent, but not subjected to any kind of bloc logic. Will that be acceptable? Will that be palatable to the Western countries? This remains to be seen. I mean, there are very powerful forces, behind Donald Trump, who are going to go out of their way and try to do everything they can to prevent some kind of an understanding from taking place. We are also not inured to the notion that we may be witnessing a black swan event between now and Trump's inauguration. It's perfectly possible that the Ukrainians, would try to somehow tweak the configuration using some dirty bomb, which might completely change the dynamics and lead the Russians to overreact. Let's not forget that the idea of issuing the permissions to use those ATACMS missiles is to goad the Russian Federation in doing something that would then justify all the rhetoric that we've heard on the Western side of things for literally years now, which is that Russia is a threat to them, that Russia is trying to reconstitute their empire, that Russia won't stop until they get to the Atlantic coast. So we have to understand how those people think. It's a very pervert and very cynical game. They're not trying to somehow be rational in a sense where they want to bring this thing to a close where everybody saves space and everybody's interests are taken into account.
Well, is that even possible, though? I mean, keep in mind, from the standpoint of the West, their objective was very clear. We want to put a strategic defeat on Russia. That was their goal. That was their objective. They wanted to do it economically and, for that matter, militarily. So, with the Russian response to that point, I mean, is there a way for both sides to save face on this? Or, no, one side has to lose in order to set a precedent? Or how do you view this?
Well, I think there are ways to have both sides save face. Um, Obviously, there are a lot of economic interests who have invested heavily into Ukraine. Uh, we've known about them for a long time. The main investment funds, they own Ukraine. They own Ukraine's political class. And I spoke about it in my book, have directly influenced the legislative agenda through their Ukrainian proxy, as far as accaparation of state-owned companies through the use of those boards, revised boards of governors, which are now, by and large, staffed with Western, individuals. So they're not going to let go of those investments. If you add to this, obviously, what will obviously take place, and we know about it now because he came out publicly, Kash Patel, basically said, notwithstanding the pardon on X, Y, and Z, bearing on what might have been going on the last 10 years in Ukraine, I'm going to be looking into this. As soon as if I get confirmed, I'm going to be, looking into what happened there. And this goes straight to, the issue of maybe running an audit, trying to find out where did the money go, who benefited from it, how was the USAID used as an instrument to embezzle some of that money.
That's right.
You're basically touching very sensitive matters here. And this adds another layer as to why we're seeing this kind of desperate approach, in trying to double down on the situation rather than laying the ground for the incoming administration to come up with a deal.
You know, I'm curious on how far do you think the Biden administration is willing to go with this? Like, because it, they have seen, they don't seem to have an issue with crossing Putin's red lines. And apparently, Putin gave a speech recently where he pointed out they are pushing us to the brink, where they're forcing us to respond, they're forcing us to retaliate. Because you're right, it seems that the Biden administration's come up with this logic that, okay, if Putin believes that Trump is going to do something different, then he's going to be less inclined to react to our provocations. So we're allowed to provocate within a certain amount of space because we believe that Putin believes that Trump is going to do something different. There's this kind of weird logic that's effectively taking place in the way that they're engaging. I guess my thing is, how far do you think they're trying to push this? Do you think that they're going for a war in a traditional sense, but they want to create a provocation for Russia to do so, meaning we are going to push this to try to provoke the Russians to respond? Or do you think, no, well, no, they don't necessarily want a war, but they want to push it to the edge of a war? What is your, and the reason why I ask this is because the entire, if you go back to William Burns wrote the memo, Net Means Net, where he pointed out we are going to end up in a civil war that Russia doesn't want to be involved in, but they will have to be involved in. Meaning from early on, they fully understood that Ukraine was a red line. It didn't stop them from pushing at all. They just kept pushing, they kept pushing, they kept pushing, knowing full well that Russia was going to have to get involved based on their own analysis of events. From your take on this, do you think that they're actually trying to provoke a war? Or do you think they're trying to get up to the edge where they want the Russians to do something that would provoke a NATO reaction? What are your thoughts? Like you said, an overreaction in this case by the Russians.
Well, I think that we're dealing with people who are almost emotionally involved. It's not just an issue of running federal policy, foreign policy. No, we're dealing with people who have obviously, objectively, a bone to pick with Russia. We're not going to get into the ins and outs as to exactly what motivates those people. It would basically take us out of the purview of our discussion. But suffice it to say, it goes way, way back. For some of them, going back a century. and those are family issues. And the problem is we have those very people in charge of U.S. foreign policy, basically using the full might of the federal government to settle the score. And so we're not dealing with rational people. And to the extent they objectively are looking at a situation happening pretty soon where everything that they've involved themselves into, they've invested themselves into, is likely coming to a grinding halt. We are dealing with a cop out on their side, which basically gets us into a uncharted territory. I mean, those people are perfectly willing to create themselves an event and blame it on Russia in order to get public opinion to go along. Because public opinion is a major component of the discussion we're having now, as far as the West is concerned. Despite the narrative being controlled by the legacy media, a lot of people increasingly are getting their news from alternate sources, and all it takes is to basically educate people and repeat and repeat until people understand that there's a different tune going on here. It's not necessarily what they've been told, that they themselves are seeing their regular daily lifestyle being adversely impacted by all the money that's going to a place which has nothing to do with the American people. If we just talk about the American people, we could talk about the European people as well. So everybody is basically fed up with this, and they are seeing their political leaderships basically acting against their own interest in favor of some kind of opaque agenda. So it's important in that sense for the establishment, as it were, to somehow reassert itself. The only way to reassert itself for the establishment would be to somehow create an event which would completely baffle people and somehow uh, strike them into their core so that they will comply. Mike Pence talked about how NATO basically has weaponized itself against uh, the public in the West. Going back to 2015, the decision was made that in order for the Western establishment, the transnational Euro-Atlantic class, to maintain its hegemony or its objectives of basically bringing to heel the mainland, the world island, Eurasia, to prevent the rise of BRICS, they would need to adopt a war economy. And this would come at the expense of what everybody in the West has taken for granted, going back to the 1945, essentially. Healthcare systems, a robust middle class, this idea of benevolent economic policies. This has to go because on a war footing, on a war economy, there's obviously no budget left for those kind of agendas. And so, to the extent they anticipate people to revolt, uh, they need to take measures to prevent any kind of populist or alternate, out of control candidate from taking power. We've seen it in Romania recently, where the so-called pro-Russian is not pro-Russian; it's just anti-war. But they had the internal polls showing that the guy was about to win the election in a landslide, and they somehow weaponized the justice system there, invoking. I mean, they don't even try to conceal anything. They don't even try to somehow dress everything up in a way that's believable to public opinion. They invoked in a very vague fashion, and the constitutional court opinion said so, that they would justify it somehow down the road. But for the time being, it had something to do with said candidate use of TikTok.
Yeah, they said TikTok.
It's
It's
crazy.
outrageous. Yeah. They did
But
the same
this is
thing here, by the way, with Trump, where they said social media that the Russians, how did they say it? they said that the Russians had Twitter feeds, Twitter videos, or Twitter
Twitter
ads.
bots. Yeah.
That they were that they spent $50,000 on Twitter bots. Hillary Clinton. Keep in mind, by the way, Clinton had a $5 million Twitter army by itself. She spent $1.2 billion on the campaign. And they said Facebook and Twitter ads, half of which took place after the election, toppled Hillary Clinton's election. And that's what they used to say the Russians were involved. And when I heard the thing of Romania, I was like, okay, this is outrageous. You guys are effectively destroying an election on TikTok ads or some to that effect that the Russians were supposed to be involved in. It is outrageous that they're willing to do that. By the way, and I want to get into that. I'm glad you mentioned that. Do you think that there's a link between South Korea and the way that they tried to overthrow the South Korean government, Romania, which I full well consider to be a coup, Georgia, where they're trying to overthrow the Georgian government, and yeah, I would even add in Syria. I mean, Donald Trump has in all of these places, you get either European or US involvement in all of these places. I mean, the one in Korea is basically a puppet of the United States. Georgia is going through the same tactics that they were using for Ukraine, just this overwhelming political push, a large share of which are coming from outside of the country. From your point of view, are all of these things interrelated to each other and related on some way to Trump coming in office?
Well, yes and no. I mean, Trump is trying to basically, it's almost like what happened with Obama back in '09 after 8 years
Mhm,
of the Bush neocon administration. Obama
mhm,
was supposed to be this somewhat messianic figure who was going to, as Colin Powell called it, a transformative figure. But it was just basically a product being unpacked and presented to the public.
mhm,
We should never underestimate the establishment propensity and skills in reinventing, retooling what is, by all accounts, the same old policies. And Obama was an example of that. We know that nothing essentially changed under him, even though he was presented with a Nobel Peace Prize as early as '09,
right,
before he
right,
even had
right.
1 year under his belt. But it was a way to present him. His first trip was to Egypt. We all remember this inaugural foreign trip to Egypt,
Mhm,
and he made that big speech there. And the guy was eloquent, which was a big departure from the bumbling Bush Jr. And basically, the system, the establishment bought themselves a new lease on life for a few years. Then we had the Arab Spring,
mhm,
and the idea was that, it was time to get rid of all those authoritarian regime and replace them with, popular will. But we all know that this was completely artificially induced. And so now we're in a situation where essentially Trump is being brought back in. Obviously, he secured somehow assurances from the establishment that they would not oppose his candidacy to begin with, and would not necessarily step into what he intends to do, at least domestically. But on the foreign policy front, I don't think we're going to see any difference. If anything, in the light of BRICS and in the light of the de-dollarization process going on now, which is a core issue of national security as far as the US establishment is concerned, they will essentially proceed on doing what they've done to the so-called axis of resistance in West Asia. They will
mhm,
isolate every component. They will deal with them separately. Either they will coup them, or they will hollow them out, or they will cut them off from any kind of assistance, and they will deal with them in isolation using proxies, to be sure. But this is the goal. So whether it's West Asia or whether it's South Korea, whether it's Romania, just to remind our listeners, is slated to basically host the largest NATO base, even bigger than the one in Germany, right on the flank with Russia, on the eastern Russian flank, eastern flank of NATO.
mhm,
So if that sounds like you know a sign that they want to kind of calm things down and retool their attitude towards Russia, uh, just it doesn't look too good. And to the
Now,
extent we
just to
have
be
a
clear,
candidate,
no,
yes,
no, please finish.
in that country, which was about to win the election, and who ran basically on a peace platform, he had to go. So this is what they do now. They're not making any apologies. In other words,
Yeah,
in Georgia, we actually have Ukrainian elements on the ground. We have members of European embassies staff, on the ground as well, coordinating the crowds to attack the parliament, to provoke the police, to try to get the police to overreact in such a way as to paint the Dream Party led government as an authoritarian government which represses democracy. It's the same old playbook, whichever way you look at it. And it's going to be interesting to see, because today is the 16th. The incumbent president, she should be stepping down. There was an election a couple of days ago. So
supposed to
let's
be.
see where that actually leads us. But they are not going to give up on Georgia. Georgia is an important way for them to start a second front. They want to try to get as many grenade or obstacles into Trump's ability to somehow bring the whole thing down in that region.
Well, that's kind of my point. Like, I would argue that Donald Trump is slightly different. Like, so the first time around, and it's not so much what Trump will do. I'm going by this notion of what they think Trump will do, what they think he will do. Maybe a little bit different than what he actually does. I mean, in the first administration, he was willing to make a deal with North Korea to get them to stop firing missiles into the Sea of Japan. He was attacked remorselessly for doing so. He stopped Obama's regime change war, even though he didn't exactly stop it. But at the very least, he stopped the CIA portion of them trying to overthrow the government directly. Um, and even this time around, Donald Trump had pointed out, well, yeah, I'll pull our troops out of Syria. He would most likely go to making a deal with North Korea. I mean, they seem to think that he is going to change orthodoxy in regards to the way we do our foreign policy. And I understand, I'm skeptical of that too, totally. So don't misunderstand me. But they seem to think it in the way that they are responding. I mean, they're essentially taking the mask off, whether it's in the places in Europe, or for that matter, North Korea, or for that matter, Syria. And at the very least, the Syrian and the North Korea angle are things that Donald Trump was directly related to in the previous administration, that they complained, that they moaned about, and they entirely attacked him for, relentlessly for it. I guess my thing is, Donald Trump will be perfectly okay with a nationalist government coming into power that is against the Ukrainian war, whether that's in Georgia or, for that matter, whether that's in Romania. And he's even complained about what they were doing, I believe, in Romania, if nothing else. Because, again, from his point of view, okay, you're trying to go after the nationalists. He considers himself a nationalist, in which case he finds a political kinship to that nationalist group that may be against the war. I guess that's where I'm coming from this angle at. It's not so much what I think Donald Trump would do. I don't know what Trump would do. It's what I'm thinking that they think, what they think he will do. And it seems that what they think he would do is going to be somewhat is upsetting the apple cart. Give me your thoughts on that. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Well, as you said, Trump is a nationalist. And as a nationalist, he's firstly concerned about US interest. To
Mhm.
the extent when he left office, the situation was not as bad as it is now as far as the economic situation of the US. Now, the US is straddled with trillions of dollars in deficits, with a significant percentage of the US debt being dumped by key actors worldwide. Is he going to basically let it happen, or is he going to have to resort to coercive measures? I think it would be a mistake to imagine Trump somehow accepting the decline of the American empire in that sense.
Mhm.
He will do whatever he needs to do because he's a nationalist again. So the dollar is again a key component of this hegemonic architecture, and he's not going to stand by and let it happen. Now, you mentioned what he said about at the time when he tried to pull the troops from Syria. He never did pull the troops from Syria. If anything, the U.S. presence was ramped up. In 2016, 2017, no less than 18 to 20 U.S. bases were built alongside the border between
That's right.
Syria and Iraq. It was under his watch that they basically pillaged Syrian oil using even a U.S. company which had obtained a waiver from the State Department at the time, where Pompeo himself announced it in August 2020. They were basically making a buck on it and
Yeah.
sending the oil back to into Turkey. And don't forget that he's also it was under his administration that the U.S. pulled out unilaterally from the JCPOA.
Hmm.
The idea was somehow to apply maximum pressure on Iran, trying to force him to extend and widen the scope of the negotiation to include ballistic capabilities and their support to what they perceived as Iran-backed militias in the region.
Hmm.
This was a non-starter for the Iranians, obviously, because that was completely outside the purview of what had been negotiated. But we can expect this maximum pressure 2.0 to be implemented as soon as he gets into office. So we're not out of forever wars by any means. And with the new configuration in West Asia now, it becomes a lot more palatable for the U.S. proxy in the region to contemplate a bunker buster, massive, air camping against Iranian installations, to be sure. And Iran won't take it standing down. They already said they would retaliate to the full extent. They
Hmm.
would attack U.S. installation in Bahrain. They will make it impossible for the U.S. to remain, unscathed, for that matter, which is exactly what the Israeli wants because they want to drag the U.S. government into their expansionist ventures. And last but not least, in terms of the world economy, well, with the basically the obstruction, the taking out of the Straits of Hormuz, that would
Hmm.
basically get the oil barrel, probably up to $300 to $400, a pops. So it's game over right there. So you can say that he's, winding down operations in Ukraine, but if the idea is to ramp him up in West Asia, with all the consequences that this can lead to, you're back where you started.
No, on that I do agree with you. The Iran thing, that's why I left Iran out because on that one he's a lunatic, to put it mildly. And again, I don't even know what he's going to do in Ukraine per se, because I think you're right. It's very possible that Putin could say these are my terms, and Donald Trump doesn't want to accept the terms because he doesn't want to look, weak or doesn't want to look bad or something to that effect. Meaning, I have no idea how any of this stuff is going to pan out because he is a nationalist. He's a wild card, if nothing else.
Hmm.
I want to go to Syria for a bit. I there was a talk. I'm not going to bring the person's name into it, but in the conversation, it pointed out that Russia abandoned Syria. That basically Russia made a deal. And by the way, I don't agree with this. I don't buy the premise of this. But that Russia made a deal in order with the Trump administration, or let's say with America, let's say it that way, in order to abandon Syria in order to get a deal on Ukraine. Why do you think the Syrian thing fell apart so quickly from your point of view?
Well, first of all, I agree with you. I don't believe there was any deals. I don't see how Russia would exchange its assets on the Syrian coast,
Agreed.
what with their ability to project their policy all the way into Africa. So, on the basis of this alone, that makes no sense. What happened in Syria? Well, a few things happened in Syria. Obviously, it all starts with the inability of the Syrian government to take into account that basically, if there's a war to be waged, they're going to have to wage it themselves. They cannot
Right.
rely on their allies. And I think that was the first mistake. and probably the federal one. Suggestions were made going back to 2018. The Russian Federation offered to completely retool the Syrian army, and they basically would accept in exchange the possibility for Russian companies to move in and get access to Syrian markets. This was refused. There was also the possibility to abide by the resolution 2254. The Russian suggested the adoption, or at least the consideration, of a draft constitution in 2017, which bore on somewhat of a federal model for Syria, which would take into account the diversity of its different populations and allow them to have somewhat, in some cases at least, autonomous status. This was refused, flat out refused. Uh, if we look at the military situation on the ground in the wake of the March 2020 ceasefire, a lot could have been done to at least contain, if not slow down, what happened on November 27th.
Mhm.
Trenches could have been built. Um, the officers who valiantly illustrated themselves during the liberation campaign between 2014 and 2019 could have been promoted within the Syrian government. They were cast aside
Yeah.
owing to sectarian rivalries within the Syrian state. And I guess there was also a miscalculation as far as Assad's perception of the possibility for Syria to cajole the United States into easing on the sanctions using the intermediaries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So the calculus was that with Syria reintegrating the Arab League, basically Assad banked on the notion that the Gulf monarchies would be able to somehow negotiate on his behalf and secure the authorization to start reinvesting into the country. Obviously, that was a miscalculation because when the time came and the people were completely, the morale was very low. The Syrian military was basically on its knees. It had not integrated the new art of war bearing on the use of drones, unlike the militants in Idlib who had received direct assistance from the SBU, the Ukrainian SBU, who had taught them how to integrate the drones. They manufactured a lot of them,
Mhm.
and we saw the difference because when operation started, basically uh, the use of drones and FVPs was like having an air force essentially for them.
Right.
So that allowed them to basically create havoc and panic and prevent any kind of organizing a defensive line for the Syrian armies. If you add into account the fact that Hezbollah was considerably weakened owing to their direct engagement, military engagement with Israel, it was almost mission impossible at this point. It's there might have been a possibility to allow time to deploy the 25th Division led by Suhail Hassan, one of the most qualified high officer of the Syrian Arab Army.
Mhm.
So qualified was he that the Russians even assigned to him Russian security guards because they basically wanted him to be, to be preserved. They had identified his skills. But as I said earlier, his successes during the liberation campaign also made him a target within the Syrian establishment. And so a lot of people like him were, unfortunately decommissioned or at least put on a freeze. That might have made a difference as far as building trenches around Idlib, putting dragon teeth everywhere, anti-tank mines personnel, manning all those installations. I mean, 5 years is a long time to create major fortification. We've seen it in
Mhm.
Ukraine, and so that would have prevented, the quick expansion of the militants, taking first Aleppo and then moving on forward until the elite forces, the elite armored divisions would have been able to be redeployed. They would have been, they would have had the initiative. They would have retained the initiative on the ground. Unfortunately, none of those fortifications were built,
Oh.
and all the capable officers were decommissioned and replaced by regular conscripts, basically, to keep an eye on this situation which was the subject of repeated intelligence reports. This was stated even by the foreign minister of
Mhm.
Iran a week ago, going back as far as October, if not earlier. So it is what it is, but it's But to come back to your question, was there a deal? No, that would make no sense whatsoever for Russia to sacrifice its bases. And what kind of a deal would that be? I mean, deals are made to be broken anyway, right?
Yeah. No, I
That would
agree
be
with
the
you. I
loss
didn't
of
think it
face,
made.
loss of prestige. I mean, to be sure, a lot of commentators have said that somehow this is going to be a difficult one for Russia to swallow. And a lot of countries that have expressed their desire to become a partner of BRICS and eventually join BRICS, who are by all accounts allies of Russia, have in some circles, but significant circles, expressed the fear that if somehow they get dumped the way they perceive it, at least the Syrian government was dumped, then what's the point to confront the American frontally?
Wow.
So
Yeah.
all this to say that the Russians are not stupid. They would have never allowed a situation like this to take place, knowing full well that the perception among their friends would be that can we trust them?
Right.
That's not
No,
something they were willing to go along. So
no, I
no,
agree with
there
you.
was no deal. Impossible.
No, I totally agree with you. I didn't think they would make a
There
deal with
was
the
there
UN.
was a there was a taking into account of the situation, which led the Russian to basically cut their losses and try to make a lemonade out of lemons.
Mhm.
And we saw that there was a change in rhetoric and semantics following the summit of foreign ministers in Doha.
Doha.
Prior to the meeting, Lavrov was talking about terrorist groups. After the meeting, he was talking about armed opposition. So that was where it happened. They basically, again, they took stock of the situation and adjusted.
Okay. Arnaud, man, thank you for this. I appreciate this conversation. I legitimately do. I really
Thank
do.
you.
Arnaud Develay, he's an international lawyer specializing in international criminal law and participated in the defense of former President Saddam Hussein, along with former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark. In the wake of the Caesar Act, he documented the illegal sanction action or regime posed against Syria while living in Damascus. He is the author of Foreign Entanglements, Biden, Ukraine, and the Fracturing of the American Political Consensus. I really enjoyed this conversation today, I swear. And I think the audience did too. We have a really good crowd today. So thank you for this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
Have a good one. All right.